I gotta get myself a little more faith, a little more love.
I'm your host, Christa Bigler, and I'm going to guess we have at least one thing in common, that we're both in pursuit of a less stressed life. On this show, I'll be interviewing experts and sharing clinical pearls from my years of practice to support high-performing, health-savvy women in pursuit of abundance and a less stressed life. One of my beliefs is that we always have options for getting the results we want, so let's see what's out there together.
Just keep breaking. I gotta get myself a little more faith, a little more love.
Hello. So I'm so used to having guests on this podcast. I don't always get to just start with gratitude. So I just want to thank you for being here. We've been publishing this podcast since 2017. And sometimes that kind of consistency isn't for the faint of heart. And I just appreciate all of you that have been along for this ride with me, whether this is your first episode, it's your 5th episode, or it's your 350th episode. I appreciate you being here. And my podcast listeners are my favorite kind of people. And one thing I always want to do is create more dialogue with the podcast because it does feel a little bit one-sided. So back when I published part 1 of my own healing crisis story a couple of months ago, we asked you for your Q&As and we've been backlogging those since. So I've dedicated the month of June to answering just your Q&As. I'll do 2 per week. So let's start with Beth. Beth asked a great question about how chlorine might have played a role in the flare I had back in 2015. She mentioned in her question that her son reacted to a non-chlorinated pool that was being treated with something called Baclosil, and she was wondering if pools should be avoided altogether when eczema is active. Of course, this answer will have nuance, so let's get into it. So when it comes to pool chemicals and eczema, we want to start with some high-quality questions as much as possible, so that's where I'm going to start. What kind of eczema are we dealing with? What's the context overall? What's the skin's baseline condition? Is there any compromise to the skin barriers that are broken open? That will always impact maybe what we do. And how well is the body handling external exposures right now? So meaning, is the skin not really flared or is it in a height of a flare? Because if we're already at a height of a flare, we're just going to have to see how this new input is going to impact it. What I don't know from Beth's question is if this is an isolated incident, which I'll get to at the end. But first, big picture, we just want to zoom out. Chlorinated pools are basically a big disinfectant bath. Chlorine is a stronger form of sodium hypochlorite, which is what's in bleach. So they're just a big old bleach bath. So that can irritate the skin for some, especially if the skin barrier is already compromised, depending on the type of skin or how it's presenting. But the nuance is that if the eczema is driven by an infection, a low-grade infection like staph, I call this inflammatory type eczema, then this giant bleach bath could be calming, like a giant bleach bath, which we've talked about on the podcast with different dermatologists that have been on here. And very often this is a recommendation from a dermatologist. So if the skin gets better from the swimming pool, it might be because it's controlling some of that overgrowth on the skin. A reminder that grows from the inside out, by the way. But there's another type of eczema. I think about this as like layers of a cake. It's not just one, but it kind of stacks. You end up with 2 layers. In kids with this environmental eczema type, that just looks like a more dry picture. It is consistent with sluggish drainage, like just more of a need to support detox and drainage. And it is also looks like you would have more chemical sensitivities. Then chlorine or some other chemical can flare. This might also, like if you've seen any sensitivities to chemicals in general, the skin is a safe place for your body to get rid of extra stuff. And so that is when you can see a bigger flare. Now, if this pool was using Baclosil instead of chlorine, I did look on their website and I was unable to find the ingredients, unfortunately. I was curious. I was trying to look at all of their different products. I was trying to figure out if it contained copper, which is a very common fungicide used in pool treatments, or another reactive compound. I had a story with a client once who had found out she was really reacting quite negatively to the copper-based pool sanitizer that she had due to some interesting fungal issues and just like copper being out of balance. So there can be some things to unpack, but I would say this would be the exception. Another potential exception that I did not include in my own story that I realized when I was working on my answer to yours was that I realized years later that I definitely did have issues with halogens. Halogens include iodine, chlorine, and bromine. Halogen displacement. We all have iodine receptor sites in our cells. And so I didn't get into that in that story. I can get into it in part 2 because I realized that in part 2 when I was not dealing with an eczema flare, but when I was dealing with a crash of stress hormones. However, because of the context of this question is with your son, with your child, I usually don't find that we need to get into working with halogens with children because they don't tend to need it like adults do. Okay, so big picture, this is why I like eczema typing. So first, knowing the type of eczema your child has, so if it's more red reactive, worse in the late afternoon and evening versus the morning. Most kids have this inflammatory type eczema, which is generally linked to gut and microbiome imbalance issues. But like I said before, types can be stacked like layers of the cake. So the longer the history, the longer someone's had something, the more layers that are usually there. Of course, there's genetic predisposition that plays into it. We hand that stuff off to our kids. We can look at our own family history to get some clues about it. But when we understand what type of eczema anyone has, like your child has, it becomes clearer to why they might be reacting and what they might actually need. So any chemical could cause a problem if someone has a lot of burden or there's something. And I will say it's very possible that particular thing is just an irritant to them. It might be the wrong thing at the wrong time. And this is the tricky part if it's just an isolated incident. Obviously, we usually don't want to create the same problem. I don't know what much context about the reaction, Beth, but I often say with clients that sometimes you can't really draw a conclusion from a one-time experience. So I hope that is helpful. Might be wrong thing at the wrong time, but this whole conversation needs to have that lens of what kind of eczema type is it to answer it appropriately and what is most appropriate and for different scenarios. So it's not a one size fits all, which is why I have a job, which is good. It's good to know that there is nuance. And if someone's trying to give you one size fits all advice, that may not apply to you because very often one size fits all advice does not always apply. When I do case audit calls with potential clients, we go through the whole history with children, especially the birth story, any symptom patterns, when things started, talk through what makes things better or worse to just help you understand where all the missing pieces can be. If your child is flaring after swimming, just don't panic, observe, look for connections. If it's continuous from different pool to different pool, of course, even though it's sodium hypochlorite or basically a big bleach bath, there can be other things that are in the pool as well that we don't always know are there. So are they flaring because of the pool, or was their system already tipping, like overfilling essentially? Those couple of little clues, I very often find a story can be very powerful. And just know, in isolated instance, we tuck that in our cap and look to see if there's a recurrence in other places. If you need any help, if you feel like you've tried a lot of things without answers, then I'd love to help people sort through that in a case review. Those are only open for the month of June, as I close those in July and August to spend time with my own family and kids. So thanks so much for your question, Beth. All right, so our second question today comes from Jen, who wrote in about her 3-year-old son who's had eczema since he was 6 months old. They've removed common food triggers, tried, just quoting, dozens of gut healing supplements, and made some progress, but he's still suffering. I wish this story was less common. It's one of the most common stories that I hear from parents with children with eczema. And it can be not only frustrating, it's exhausting, and it feels like you're doing everything right and still getting stuck. So I don't have all of the context here, so I want to share about some of the additional context that helps us figure out what the gaps are. When eczema shows up around 6 months, like Jen said with her son, that's usually the time we introduce solids, which can be a big clue. It doesn't mean food is the issue or that's a primary issue. It means that the way we're processing those proteins, those food particles, might be part of the issue. It's a downstream thing. So in order to support Jen the most, or any child, especially 5 and under, what I really want to understand is full context. What's the birth story? What's the family history of allergens or eczema? How was the baby delivered? What happened right before, during, after birth, or around, especially since eczema showed around 6 months, that kind of set this up potentially? Was there any antibiotic exposure that may have affected the gut microbiome, C-section, et cetera, or how the baby is digesting things? Because let's face it, babies are born and they're still maturing, right? They're still maturing. Everything is still maturing, including digestion. Gut healing, to me, certainly isn't about removing foods or throwing supplements at it alone. It's really knowing what system is driving the issue. I think that most symptoms, eczema as a symptom, come from an imbalance of systems. And then through that imbalance, there is deficiency. So a lot of people will focus on leaky gut or intestinal repair. But in most kids, I see that the real issue is dysbiosis or an imbalance of gut microbes. That might be bacteria, might be fungus, it might be something else. But if you try to repair the gut lining without addressing the imbalance first, the results can be limited. And I want to give some context around where this can go wrong too next, but it can be like trying to reseed a lawn where you haven't really pulled weeds. Like you're still going to have those weeds, or you might be like compromising the soil and it's draining all the nutrients from the soil. And that can impact how fast skin is healing, et cetera. This is just doing things in the right order. And there can be exceptions to things, but I think the right order does matter. So I want to look at like gut, drainage system, hormone interactions, especially for adults and kids. I will address nutrients at a baseline level. Usually the kids I see are really well nourished. They have unicorn, amazing parents. But in kids, we gently support all systems that need help, and we want to target them and go in the right order. When I'm doing case reviews for people, I find that families have often done a lot, but they're missing just a couple of steps, or things are done in the wrong sequence. In short, there's gaps. Another really common gap is just missing, not great interpretation of test results or not great protocols. So once we fix those gaps, we can get traction. And the good news is the less time you have eczema, which is usually the easier it is to solve. So I just mean if a child has eczema for 6 to 12 months or 18 months, it can generally, or an adult, if you have had eczema for less than 5 years, it can be easier to resolve than anyone who's had it for more than a decade or more than a couple of decades. Not saying anyone can't bring the body back into balance. It's just that it makes sense, right? More time in can sometimes mean there's more of a road to recovery. So Jen, you've done so much already, which tells me you're really committed. And I also know from experience that this kind of puzzle needs like multiple layers in the right order. So if you're doing the same thing and you're not seeing results, sometimes it's just worth zooming out with a set of fresh eyes to see what's being overlooked. And I'm sure you've thought of that too. That is why case audits exist, so we can just go deeper, take that pressure off your shoulders in case that's helpful. Those are open in June. So thank you, Beth and Jen, for your questions this week. And thank you for spending a little time with me today. I love when you share your thoughtful and honest questions, because I think that your story can help so many others that are walking a similar path feel less alone. If you are feeling stuck or unsure, or you're not sure what your next step should be, just know you don't have to figure it out alone. I'm here when you're ready. And in the meantime, keep tuning in, keep asking questions, and most importantly, keep believing that healing is possible. We'll talk to you next week. Bye.
Just keep breaking.